Welcome, welcome, welcome to our English Speaking Union Happy Hour, The Art of Prose, an interview with Ward Farnsworth, and Roger Stacey. Today's happy hour is sponsored by the Boston branch of the ESU. As ideas for these lectures come from you, our members and viewers, please share any ideas or topics for an upcoming speaker or talk using the survey that will appear at the end of our program tonight. Before we get into that program, I wanted to make a couple of quick technical announcements. The first is that we will be holding a question and answer session when we finish the primary part of the interview. You can enter your questions into either the Q&A module or the chat module. Buttons to access both of these are located at the bottom of your Zoom screen if you are using a desktop computer or laptop. You can do this at any point during the presentation. It doesn't have to be during the Q&A portion when we begin to review the questions. So if any point during Roger and Ward's conversation you have a question that comes to mind, please feel free to input it in the chat, and we'll get to all questions in the order received. I also want to take a moment to recognize the branches with the most registered members for today's event. Those are the Greenwich, Connecticut branch, the Central Florida branch, and the New York branch. But now to really start us off today, I'd like to welcome the president of the ESU Boston branch, Paul Begosion. Paul?
Thank you, Josh. And welcome to another in our successful series of virtual happy hours. We're featuring Roger Stacey, the vice president of our Boston branch, interviewing Ward Farnsworth, the dean of the University of Texas Law School. But before we get to that, let me remind you that this is a happy hour. So those of you can lift your glass at this point. This is a Dubonnet, which is mostly gin with Dubonnet, and with a slice of orange that I understand is the Queen's favorite drink. And certainly with what she's been going through this year, she certainly deserves a few of these. So I have also a happy announcement to make before we get into the meat and bones of the program. We are going live in Boston. So all of you who are registered, who are hear this, I understand there were 240 people registered. If you hear this, you're all invited to attend on June 20th, our gala, our spring gala, which will commemorate the Queen's 95th birthday. And we will be having this at the Country Club in Brookline. So mark it on your calendar, June 20th. I hope to see many of you there. I think you'll find it to be a wonderful event. This will be Boston ESU's first live event in a year and a half. So we're all looking forward to that. So we all want to stay healthy for that.
Yep, be live.
Secondly, I have a sad announcement, of course, sad news that we're all aware of, that Prince Phelp passed away last week. And I had the opportunity to be in his company in 1987 at the New York Yacht Club. A media friend of mine in New York invited me to a lunch in which Ted Turner was going to be recognized 10 years after his America Cup win with his boat, the Courageous, in 1977. And Prince Philip was a surprise guest, completely unannounced, not promoted, and he was just marvelous. He spoke off the cuff for a few minutes with an all-male audience, a couple of little innuendo and salacious remarks, very humorous. He met everybody, shook hands with everybody, posed for pictures, and just terrific and a memorable experience for me personally. So Prince Philip passed away last week, and I wanted to share a few highlights of a truly remarkable life of courage, steadfastness, and loyalty. Prince Philip was born a prince of Greece and Denmark. He married Elizabeth in 1947 when he was 26 and she was 21. He served with distinction in the Royal Navy during World War II in both the Mediterranean and the Pacific. And in one skirmish in 1941 off the Greek coast, his quick use of a searchlight helped his ship sink 2 Italian cruisers in less than 5 minutes. The next year, at the age of 21, Prince Philip became one of the youngest officers in the Navy to serve as first lieutenant and second in command of his own destroyer. After Elizabeth's coronation in 1952, he gave up his naval commission to take up his duties for the royal family as the patron of many environmental charities, including the World Wildlife Fund, of which he became president in 1961. Throughout his long life, Philip always remained devoted to his wife, Elizabeth, who described him once as her, quote, constant strength and guide, end of quote, always on her side and always serving his family and country. Rest in peace, Prince Philip. So tonight, we feature the Dean of University of Texas Law School, Ward Farnsworth, on his insightful and surprisingly, I found it surprisingly entertaining book entitled Classical English Style. In recent years, ESU National has emphasized the phrase English in action. Dean Farnsworth's book certainly gives lots of examples of how such memorable historical characters such as Lincoln, Churchill, and Edmund Burke placed English in action to great effect in crafting prose that they used for debate and for writing. And in fact, that was to me the most entertaining aspects, is to see how Dean Farnsworth actually crafted the anecdotes that indicated the brilliant use of language by Churchill and Lincoln. The book is highly recommended by me personally. I hope you have the chance to pick it up. The book is called Classical English. At this point, I want to introduce a friend. In fact, one of the great things about ESU that those of you who have been members for a few years probably realize, you meet people that you otherwise would not meet through our social events, through our cultural events, through our entertainment events. And Roger is such a person. Roger has been on the board of ESU Boston for over 30 years, serving with memorable distinction as our vice president. Whenever we have something that requires style and the use of language, we always pass it by Roger to get his okay, because he is a tenacious defender of the English language and a brilliant spokesperson for the English language. In fact, this last year, Roger was also a judge at our annual high school Shakespeare competition. Roger received his undergraduate degree from Hamilton College in upstate New York, and he received his master's in education from Harvard University a few years later. He also subsequently was educated at Tufts University and at Oxford University in England. And he has written a number of different articles and has taught with distinction at Buckingham Brown and Nichols here in Cambridge, and has been retired for the last several years and is widely traveled. In fact, the English-speaking Union Board in Boston always looks forward to Roger traveling because he comes back with such fabulous anecdotes, and he's a wonderful raconteur. And we just hope that, Roger, you'll be able to travel again in the near future and come back with more memorable stories. So at this point, I'm going to turn the program over to ESU Boston's Vice President, Roger Stacey.
Well, thank you very much, Paul. I also wanted to say that we were lucky enough to attend the dinner that Prince Philip gave at Buckingham Palace when he relinquished his patronage of the ESU for having served for 60 years as our patron. And the other notable thing about Prince Philip is that it was his marriage to Queen Elizabeth that caused my family to buy their first television set. At any rate, tonight, before we begin, a slight disclaimer. The interview with Ward tonight will concern English style and not correctness. So, our guest today is Ward Farnsworth, as you've heard, the Dean and John Jeffers Research Chair at the University of Texas School of Law. His manifold accomplishments were detailed on the announcement for this session, and so I won't go over them again. At his request, I'll keep the introduction simple. Farnsworth is the author of books on law, philosophy, rhetoric, and chess. Welcome to the ESU Happy Hour, Ward.
Thank you very much, Roger. Wonderful to be with you and with a group so interested in these issues.
Good. Well, let's start right off with a question for you. This book is the third in a series. What was your purpose or goal in writing these books, and what do they have in common?
Well, I love the English language, and especially the beautiful and effective use of it. As I'm sure everybody who's chosen to show up today knows, there's a large genre of books on that subject. Everybody has their own little shelf of books about how to write well. It has always seemed to me, though, that those books, especially the recent ones, don't really do very much to explain the writing that I've always liked best. I love reading the writing of Lincoln and Churchill, Edmund Burke, who Paul mentioned, others who write fiction. I love Charles Dickens. These books about style have a lot of good advice in them, but they never seem to me to explain what makes the greatest writing sound so good. And some of that's just very hard to explain. Genius and inspiration are very difficult matters to talk about. But it did seem to me that there were some things one could say, and more than one could say, that had been said. And so these books are really an effort to get at that, to take writing that has really stood the test of time and ask, what are the patterns or properties in this writing that we can see and talk about? And in some cases, we might be able to adapt for our own use. And if we can't do that, that we can still understand and enjoy understanding.
Thank you. And I think you've anticipated a couple of my subsequent questions, so I'm going to skip to this one. Yours is a book I've discovered that needs to be dipped into, not one to sit down and read from cover to cover. To gain a sense of it, perhaps it would be good to look at an example of your approach in the book. For instance, the first part involves choices between different kinds of words. Can you talk about that?
Certainly, be grateful for the chance to do so. So what I'm going to do is share a few slides like this. So here's the cover of the book. This book is the third in a series, as you mentioned. The first is called Classical English Rhetoric. The second is Classical English Metaphor. This is Classical English Style, and it covers a different set of issues than the other books do, the kinds of basic issues covered in other books like The Elements of Style or other guides to good writing. So the first thing I wanted to talk about is geographic. I realize this will be well known to most of our audience, but it's a useful reminder. We have an expression, Anglo-Saxon, in our language, which usually is used to refer to all things related to the English and the English speaking. So if somebody talks about in America, somebody being a WASP, derisively, they mean a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, and they mean somebody descended from the Brits. And when the French worry about Anglo-Saxon hegemony, they're worried about cultural hegemony by English speakers, people in America and England. But it's useful to remember that the Angles and Saxons came from the northern part of Germany. That's where Saxony was. That's where Anglia was, and they ended up settling the eastern part of Britain. This is worth understanding in the background, because in the English language we have two sources of words. We have words that were brought over by the invaders from Anglia and Saxony around 500 or 600 AD, and then we had a later invasion of Britain by the French in 1066, and they brought the French language with them. And there was a competition between the Germanic Old English, the language of Beowulf and the like, that was already there, and the French that the invaders brought with them. And the modern English that we all speak now is a combination of those two tongues that sort of competed for a while and then eventually fused or combined into one language. And in that process of competition and combination, what often happened was words from both traditions made it into the language. They didn't fuse into one language. The language just accommodated both of them. So I want to talk about some examples. In English, we have the pleasure that almost anything can be said in words that are either Saxon, that is derived from Old German antecedents, what we now think of as German antecedents, or Latinate or Romance words, which came into our language from French. And if you really want to understand attractive English, I think it's useful to understand which kinds of words are in each category. So here's an example. There's a Saxon word, make. There's a Latinate word, create. They basically mean the same thing, but one is descended from the Old English Saxon, and the other is descended from Latin via French. Need versus require. Need is the Saxon word, require is the Latinate word. Break is the Saxon word, damage is the Romance word. Come or arrive. So even if you don't know any French or Latin, I think anybody can look at these two columns of words and see and intuitively grasp their difference. The Saxon words are always shorter. They're always simpler. They sound a little grittier. The Latinate words all sound a little more fancy and a little more refined. So I say in the book that it's a fine parlor game to try to think of a Latinate or Romance equivalent in English for any Saxon word that you can think of. It's usually not too difficult to do. And we'll talk more about the properties of these. But Jorge Luis Borges, the Argentinian writer and one who I admire so much, said that he considered English a much richer language than Spanish, just because English speakers had these wonderful choices to make between different lines of descent in their words that have these different qualities. So now what I'll do is give you a chance to look at some other words like this. You can find an equivalent if you want. I mentioned the game. If the Saxon word is see, what is the Romance equivalent? Perceive, ask or inquire, kin, relative, luck, fortune, fair, equitable, next, subsequent. The words on the left are all one syllable. The words on the right are all multisyllabic. Same thing here, going the other direction. If you wanted a simpler word for desist, you'd use the word stop. Desist is derived from French. Stop is derived from Saxon. Execute, the simple word is kill. Conversation, the simple word is talk. Let's have a talk. Something's enjoyable. The simple word is fun. Something is constricting. The Saxon word is tight. This is the final example. It's the last example. And so we can go on like this all day, but anybody can, when they're writing, sense the difference between these words and so often make choices between them. So the choice then arises between these words in general. If you're going to use one kind of word or the other, which one should you pick? And there's a strong tradition in the literature of style, of English style, in favor of Saxon words. For example, I'll talk about general differences, but let's just talk about differences and then I'll get to the recommendations. If you look at these two kinds of words in general, what do you notice about them? Well, their length is different, as we talked about. Acquire is a longer word than get. And one way to sense the difference between them, if you're not sure, is that words that are Romance or from French or Latin usually can have extensions fused onto them to create different parts of speech. So acquire can become acquisition. The verb can become a noun, or it can become acquisitive, the adjective. The word get doesn't take suffixes like that. You can't easily turn it into those other kinds of long words by adding tion. That's a tip-off that it's a Saxon word. The two words just sound different. So the word take is Saxon. The word appropriate is Latin and a Romance. The word pick is Saxon. The word choose comes to us from French. Well, pick and choose sounds different. They sound different. Saxon words like pick tend to have hard sounds in them like that. The word choose, words from French tend not to. They're more mellifluous. Their tone is different. So the tone of words that came into our language from French tends to be more refined and fancier, as we saw. And this really becomes clear when you think about slang. Most of our really foul language comes to us from the Saxon lines of descent. And I'm not going to do it here in this very polite interview, but you can insert your own examples. You can imagine the most taboo words in our language, and then think about Latin alternatives that you're able to say in polite company. You can say the word copulate, no problem in a moment like this, but you don't want to use the Saxon word for it. And the same goes for various body parts. Even if you're not using those kinds of words, in general, Saxon words sound closer to the earth and grittier and less refined, less polite, less formal. Finally, I think the two kinds of words, Saxon and Latin, are Romance. They appeal to different capacities. Saxon words tend to go straight for the gut. They're words that provoke feeling much more quickly, and they're easier to understand right away. So, for example, the word burn, which is of Saxon derivation, versus the word incinerate, which is a Romance word, or the word alight, which is from Saxon, or illuminate, which is Romance. If you talk about somebody getting burned, you can feel what that means. It comes to mind right away, and it's felt viscerally. The word incinerate takes a little extra split second of translation in the mind to understand what you're really talking about. So I think you could say Latin or Romance words speak more to the head or the mind, and Saxon words more to the heart or the feelings. Okay, So Strunk and White said in the book, The Elements of Style, which I bet everybody here has spent time with, Anglo-Saxon is a livelier tongue than Latin. So use Anglo-Saxon words. That's the general preference. In the Fowler brothers, in their great book, The King's English, made the same recommendation. Winston Churchill made the same recommendation. So did George Orwell. Everybody who's weighed in about this issue on the subject of style has the same thing to say. Saxon words are better. And that may well be true as a general matter. If you were going to live by one rule, that'd be a good rule. So there are famous examples. You look at the King James Bible, considered a wonderful monument of Saxon English. And God said, let there be light, and there was light. Ask, and it shall be given you. Seek, and ye shall find. Knock, and it shall be opened unto you. Every word of both these examples is Saxon, not a Romance word in sight. And that's part of the great power of them, the simplicity of them, the beautiful arrangement of these very simple words. That's one of the lessons beginning writers all need to learn, is that attractive English isn't usually the art of selecting beautiful words. It's usually the art of arranging humble words beautifully. So all that's fair enough. But what the book claims is that this explains a great deal. It even explains some of Lincoln. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here, as he said in the Gettysburg Address. That's a heavily Saxon passage, one or two Latinate words, mostly Saxon. Or as he said in his speech at Cooper Union, let us have faith that might makes right, and in that faith let us to the end dare to do our duty as we understand it. Lincoln's prose is full of language like this that's beautifully simple, and that ring of simplicity that it has can be traced back. He just keeps using Saxon words, and that's an important part of his charm. But there's another aspect to the greatness of Lincoln and to the greatness of Churchill and the greatness of Oliver Wendell Holmes and other writers whose writing really stands the test of time. They don't just use Saxon words. They mix them very artfully with Romance or Latinate words. So let me take another famous line from Lincoln, from his House Divided speech, when he was talking about the potential for a civil war. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the House to fall. But I do expect it will cease to be divided. It will become all one thing or all the other. This is a very beautiful, characteristic passage of Lincoln's. So let's ask ourselves, is it Latin and Romance, or would you say it's Saxon in character in the way that he chose his words? And what I'd submit to you is it's both. It's both in very interesting ways. The first line, I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. This is a Latinate line. Expect, union, and dissolved are all words that came into English from French. And that sounds like sort of a fancier, more highfalutin part of the passage. Then he says, I do not expect the house to fall. And suddenly he's turned more Saxon. House and fall, these are words of one syllable. They're simple, they're Saxon. What is the relationship between those two halves of that first part of the passage? Well, the second one's really restating the first. They express the same sentiment, one in more Latinate language, then he says it again in more Saxon words, using a metaphor and drawing on the Bible. But I do expect it will cease to be divided. Again, what is this? This time again, it's Latinate, it's Romance. Expect, cease, and divided. These are each words that could be replaced with Saxon words, but he chooses to use longer words. And then he says, it will become all one thing or all the other. And again, what is the relation between the last line and what came right before it? It will cease to be divided. It will become all one thing or all the other. He's simply repeating himself. He's saying it twice. Your modern copy editor would get out the red pen and say, omit needless words. No need to say this so many times. But he did need to say it so many times because he wanted to say everything twice. Lincoln, in effect, was bilingual. He could speak Saxon and he could speak Romance English. And he always tried to say everything in two different, not always, he often tried to say any given thing both ways to convey his message to the head and to the heart, to capture the ideals of his audience and also to enable them to feel what he said and to feel the resonance of it and sort of tie it to a stake in the ground. Lincoln loved what the book calls the Saxon Finish, starting a sentence in sort of Latinate fancy words and then ending it with a series of very simple words that brings it down to earth. That's a very powerful rhetorical idea that anybody can use when they're trying to express themselves. After you've conveyed your idea in fancier, more precise language, it's a very powerful thing to bring up a sentence or especially a paragraph down to the ground by using simple Saxon words of one syllable and emphasizing those at the end. Here's an example from Oliver Wendell Holmes, who's the finest writer that the American law has ever had. A famous sentence from his in a case about free speech. And ask yourself as I'm reading, is this sentence Latinate or is it Saxon? If there's any principle of the Constitution that more imperatively calls for attachment than any other, it is the principle of free thought. Not freedom of thought, not free thought for those who agree with us, but freedom for the thought that we hate. Well, it's the very same thing. It's Latinate and then it's Saxon. The first half of the sentence is full of fancy words, words that came into the English from French. Principle, constitution, imperatively, attachment, principle. And then at the end, I think you have maybe 20 words in a row where you have got one that's Romance, and every other one of them is Saxon. And notice that he's really saying a lot of the same things twice. Not freedom for those who agree with us, but freedom for the thought that we hate. That is a way to take the fancy stuff at the start of the sentence and make it unmistakable, make it visceral, drive it home. And that's what Saxon words do. But the point is, they do it best after Latinate words. Roger and I might talk about this more later, but the point I'm trying to emphasize is it's the contrast, it's the opposition between the use of one style of word and then the other that makes the second so powerful. It's not relentless use of Saxon words. It's Saxon words after the ear has been prepared for them by Latinate words, after the ear has indeed been made hungry for them. Churchill sometimes liked to do the opposite. I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat. We have before us an ordeal of the most grievous kind. Well, is it Saxon or is it Romance? As usual, it's both. But this time it's reversed. The first sentence is heavily Saxon. It's very easy to visualize. The words are mostly words that came in, not entirely, but mostly words that came into English from the Saxon line, mostly words of one syllable. Then we have before us an ordeal of the most grievous kind. Well, suddenly these words are French. And what are these two sentences but a restatement of each other? The second one adds nothing new in substance to the first, but he said it twice, because like Lincoln, Churchill was, in this funny way I'm describing, bilingual. He liked to say things twice, to say something in a Saxon way that was down to earth, and then to restate it in a way that was more an appeal to the head and to the ideals of the listener. And at the bottom, I invite comparison to the way Lincoln expressed himself in his speech. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall. Here's the last example, something Churchill said. We would rather see London laid in ruins and ashes than that it should be tamely and abjectly enslaved. Anybody who hears this and is familiar with Churchill knows this sounds like Churchill. But why does it sound like Churchill? What did Churchill do that makes this kind of sentence cause us to recognize him? Well, there's a bunch of things going on, but part of it is he loved to mix Saxon and Latinate words. He loved to pair them. We'd rather see London laid in ruins and ashes. Do we really need both words, ruins and ashes? Well, he did, because ruins is Romance and ashes is Saxon. Tamely and abjectly enslaved. Do we really need tamely and abjectly? Well, he did, because tamely was Saxon and abjectly is Romance. And laid and is at the beginning is Saxon and enslaved is Romance. Churchill liked to go back and forth between these words, use pairs of them, restate what he was saying, use them next to each other. I think in part just because the tension of the sounds in these words, when they push against each other, sounds so captivating to the ear and so eloquent and beautiful and memorable. So I'm going to leave it, I'll leave it there. For the slides, enough slides, we can just have conversation now. But I wanted to give those of you who have not seen the book a taste of what it's like. The book is a collection of discussions like that get down into the details of the prose of some of the people who I think have spoken the most beautiful English, to ask in detail just why does it sound the way it does? What are the patterns and techniques, and especially what are the contrasts and oppositions that create the energy and the power and the force that make some of this language so very memorable? So Roger, thank you for your patience with a long answer. I promise none of my future answers will be nearly so long, but I thought it would be useful to provide some sort of taste of the approach the book takes.
Yeah, I'd much rather hear you talk than hear me talk, so there we go. Your mention of Lincoln, by the way, reminds me that when you take the dust jacket off your book, there's a silhouette of Abraham Lincoln there, and I was wondering if you could explain why that is.
Yeah, I don't know how visible it is, but I'll show you. This is what Roger's talking about. So Lincoln is sort of a hero of this book and also a hero of the other two books, but especially this one. I think he's a great person to think about if you love good writing. A part of that's just because he wrote so beautifully. We know that Lincoln spent an enormous amount of time reading the King James Bible and reading Shakespeare. He was a true Shakespeare aficionado, and he even endured ridicule for his love of Shakespeare during his presidency. It's fun to imagine having that problem as a country, I think, having a president who likes Shakespeare too much. But all that reading rubbed off on his writing. And there's several reasons why I think this is useful to think about now. One is that Lincoln read all this stuff, but he didn't try to write that way. You know, he wrote like Lincoln. When you read Lincoln, you can hear little echoes of the King James Bible and of Shakespeare and the way that he uses words, but you're definitely not reading somebody who's trying to imitate Lincoln or the King James Bible. That would have sounded absurd. So he didn't try to do that. But nevertheless, he shows you how reading good English can influence in very delightful ways the use of somebody's English in a different era. And that's a good lesson for us, because that's also how we now have to read Lincoln or read Churchill. Nobody wants to imitate Lincoln or Churchill, or even if you did, you probably couldn't, and it would sound strange if you did. But what you can do is invite the influence of these wonderful writers into your own use of language in the same way that Lincoln invited the indirect influence of the sources he read into his writing. And there's one other point to make about this, which is that Lincoln is, I think, a beautiful writer in ways that nobody in public life is beautiful now. But he's also never what you'd call purple. So people often think about the great writing of the past, the kind that I like to talk about, as being fancier than what we have now, and that nobody wants to be so fancy anymore. We're all more unpretentious. Well, Lincoln was not pretentious, not in the least. Nobody thinks that he wrote a very fancy style. He wrote a style that's mostly by reputation considered very plain. Nevertheless, he was a master of these principles I'm describing. He used contrast between Saxon and Latinate words very artfully, probably unconsciously most of the time, but nevertheless, he knew exactly how to use these words in a way that was totally free from pretentiousness. And that's something everybody wants now. So I think Lincoln's a very apt hero for everybody who loves the English language.
I remember when I was teaching that we looked at some writing by Martin Luther King and also noticed the influence of the Bible and older writing in there. So that's a more contemporary example, perhaps.
It is indeed.
I was going to ask you if the principles you describe in the book are based on writers like Lincoln and Churchill and the way they used language. To what extent are the principles still valid nowadays? Perhaps you've covered that, but maybe you'd like to say something more about it.
Well, I do think they have to be adapted. I mean, there are principles that the book talks about that are easily transferable to the customs of modern English. I mentioned one of them in my little slideshow, the idea of if you've used Latinate words or fancier Romance words, you can ground them afterwards with words of the Germanic or just the simpler type if you don't want to worry about etymology. There are other ideas in the book that are probably harder to use now. For example, Oliver Wendell Holmes was a great writer, in part because he used contrasts of other kinds so effectively too. For example, the book contains a graph showing how long the sentences were in Oliver Wendell Holmes' judicial opinions, and compared to the lengths of sentences you'd see now. And the funny thing is, their average length is not that different. That your modern judicial opinion has an average sentences of 20 to 25 words, same with Holmes's opinions. But Holmes got there through much wider variation. His long sentences are a lot longer than anything you'd see a judge write now. And his short sentences are also shorter than most judges would ever try to write now. So Holmes will have these swings from a 70-word sentence to a 4-word sentence. And it makes the 4-word sentence so powerful and memorable. Nowadays, you almost never see this, but it's very hard to do now because your modern reader has been conditioned to resent 70-word sentences. They just don't have the patience. So in effect, what the book says is there are some instruments that have been removed from the orchestra. There are certain things that writers of 100 years ago could pull off that are much harder to pull off now because the attention spans of the modern audience have been trained to not put up with certain kinds of contrasts that at one time were tools with which wonderful things could be done. I still think it's worth understanding those tools, because even if you can't quite do what Oliver Wendell Holmes did, you can still learn about how to alternate long and short sentences, even if not in such an extreme way. You can still use that basic principle to do great things. You know, the book suggests that you can compare some of the things that it offers like that to a book about how movies used to be made, or how buildings used to be designed. You can't make movies now that look just the way movies used to, and you can't design buildings now that look just the way buildings used to. But a good architect studies that stuff, and a good filmmaker studies that stuff. And when they do what they do, even if they have clients or a public that won't accept, classical design, they can still have classical elements in their speech and writing, or in their architecture or films, that I think benefit from their historical knowledge.
Thank you. In that connection, Ken Burns and PBS have focused quite a bit on Hemingway's pared down writing style lately. And he himself said that all American literature comes from a novel called Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain. And in Huckleberry Finn, Twain disparaged both English politics and English writers. Have you considered the differences between British and American approaches to style?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, of course. I find it fascinating. I think it's a rare sentence if you're in London. It's a rare sentence in a public place that you read that wouldn't have been said a little differently in a public place in the United States. And it's always fun to think about the subtle differences and how things are worded in that way. I think that there are certain things and certain kinds of eloquence that are possible in British English that are very difficult in American English. One reason for that, actually, it may have to do with the influence of Hemingway and some of the trends that interested him. But in a British English, it's still possible to have a kind of formality that is very unfashionable in America. And that formality makes certain things possible rhetorically. For example, if you watch Question Time in the Parliament, you often get you get delicious insults that are very hard to make as delicious in America, because in England, there's still a formality that's considered appropriate. And when you dress up an insult in great formality, it can add to the insult, and you can also allow you to get away with more. But in America, I think that kind of formality is considered sort of undemocratic, and it makes people suspicious. And so so politicians don't want to do it. They all want to sound like just folks. But if they sound like just folks, they've taken away one kind of contrast that's actually a very useful thing rhetorically. So there are lots of differences, but that I think is a significant one.
Thank you. I've always found British conversation in particular more playful, and to some extent more marked by artifice than typical American plain speaking, the sort of John Wayne approach to talk that is popular in some places here.
Yeah. Well, that's, if I may say, that I think that's very right, that there's an American love of the plain. It's part of the American cultural obsession with democracy and anti-elitism and class mobility and all of that, I think. And unfortunately, I think it's actually had a bad effect on the way people think about writing. So that if you look at the literature on good English in America, it's all relentlessly focused, not all of it, most of it is relentlessly focused on the value of being plain, that as if efficiency were the only value in good writing. And don't get me wrong, efficiency is a wonderful value in good writing. It's crucial. It's probably the first lesson everybody should learn. And it's the most important thing that good writing can be. It can be clear, concise, all those things. But clarity and concision are not enough to explain why Lincoln or Churchill were successful. You can have clear, concise writing and speech that has charm and fire and that's memorable. And you can have clear, concise writing that doesn't have any of these features. And when you focus just on efficiency, you don't leave any room to talk about whatever makes writing anything better than that. And I think that's just a missing piece of the puzzle when people think about what makes writing great. It's never one thing. It's never pushing in one direction. It's usually the workings or the tension between 2 points of some sort or another.
Thank you. Do you think that the quality of English used in American public and political life has declined? And if so, why?
Well, it does seem that way to me, and I hesitate to say it because I think that there's a risk of thinking that the good old days were better than they were. But I do think it's very difficult to find anybody in public life who uses the language in a way that can compare with an Abraham Lincoln or a Winston Churchill. And it's an interesting thing to ask about why that is. I do think that technology eventually has indirect but very profound effects on the way people use language. So radio and television, and then the internet and social media. I think these technologies encourage and then sometimes require people to use language in a certain way if they don't want to sound ridiculous, or if they want to reach a lot of people at once. And if you want to do that, I think there's a strong tide toward not trying to sound impressive or rhetorical. At least in America, it's considered a very politically unattractive thing to make it look like you're trying too hard for eloquence. And I just think people read less. I mean, Lincoln was very eloquent because he spent enormous amounts of time, as I said, reading Shakespeare and the Bible. If you spend thousands of hours reading those sources, you're going to sound a little different than you would if you spent thousands of hours reading Twitter. And your modern person in public life is spending their thousands of hours reading things of much less quality than Lincoln or than Churchill did. Churchill also was a voracious reader of very great classic English. In the end, I think we read and we write and speak what we've read and heard. And I think people hear and read lesser English than they used to. And so what they produce is also a little less impressive, or in some cases, a lot less impressive.
Thank you. In fact, I was going to ask you if, and perhaps you've already just covered this, what you think has been the effect of social media on the way that we use language in this country today?
Well, hate to sound like a Luddite, but I find it a great misfortune. I think that not only does it cause a degradation in just the quality of people's use of English, but needless to say, I think everybody understands this, just what it does to the quality of discourse in general, in my opinion, has been a disaster. And it's a very worrisome disaster. It's not how it gets reversed. But I think it leads to a real erosion of patience, humility, people listening to each other. All the most fundamental properties of constructive discourse are really having an uphill struggle against the opposite tendencies that are cut loose by Twitter, Facebook, and every other social media outlet. It's a serious problem, in my judgment, for us culturally, politically, in every respect.
Thank you. Do you have any more books on language planned for your series?
Well, I hope so. I don't want to say too much about them because these things are always fragile when they're in the inception, but I have at least one, maybe two more in mind for the series. I think there's a little more that could be said about why these writers are so memorable to us. The books are not, the books have not exactly been bestsellers. They're somewhat obscure, but they found enough of an audience for the publisher to be willing to put up with a little more of the same. So I do hope to have a little more coming for those who enjoy this sort of thing.
Well, thank you very much indeed. It's been a great pleasure talking with you today. And I am now going to turn this over to Josh Keppel, who will give us some questions from those who've joined us on Zoom. Many thanks again.
My pleasure, Roger. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Roger. And thank you, Ward, for that really fascinating kind of introduction to the book's contents. I'm going to just jump right in because we do have some questions that have already kind of arrived in our chat and Q&A boxes. If you have any questions, please enter them in there. We'll get to them in the order received. Our first question actually comes from Phil Williams of our Charlottesville branch in North Carolina, who you've kind of touched on this, but I think I'm going to kind of bring his question as he sought comment here on linguistic evolution being inevitable. But is linguistic degradation, obfuscation also inevitable, as well as perhaps unfortunate and potentially dangerous?
Well, first of all, of course, it is inevitable. Language never stands still. And is degradation inevitable? Well, again, I want to be a little careful because one can sound so easily like such a grouch. I'm not sure that's the case, but am I tempted by that thought? Of course I am. I don't know whether, I mean, you can look back at the evolution or decline of other languages, and people are always complaining that language is not what it used to be, and that it's been in a constant state of decline. You can find this in every generation. I mean, in the generation of speech that I like best, you can absolutely find people saying it ain't what it used to be. It's now going way downhill. And so it might just be that this is something we're all conditioned to, is to prefer what came in an earlier age. But what I do think is that you can objectively say there's been a decline in the number of, in the kinds of options available to the speaker and writer. So if it's just the case that you simply cannot use sentences, long sentences as much anymore as you used to. A writer used to be able to write sentences that were 100 words long and get away with it. And that enabled the writer to set up a sentence that was 6 words long in a way that was spectacularly effective. And that's simply off the table now. Same thing with certain words. There are a lot of words that used to get used a lot that have just gone away because it's now considered more appropriate to write for the widest possible audience, including people who don't know those words. So if your stock of words is decreasing and your stock of devices is decreasing because you can't use such long sentences anymore. So if the orchestra is just getting smaller, I think you might be able to objectively describe that as a kind of degradation or decline. You just got fewer instruments that can be played to create music. You can still create beautiful music with fewer instruments, but there are options that are no longer available. And that seems to me a kind of degradation. I'm not sure that's inevitable. I just think it's happened. And it's happening in part because of technological advances that, nobody can control. Great question, though.
Our next question comes from Adele Stern in New York, who asks, can you compare, contrast August Wilson with William Shakespeare?
The short answer is not competently, no. I'm so sorry. I try to stick with comparisons of writers, so I'm strong enough in my knowledge of to really do a good job. So I'll have to give that more thought than I can do in this format. My regrets.
Our next question, so I believe this is part of the discussion on the origins of words in coming to the British Isles. So any comment on the name of foods? Beef cow, veal calf, pork pig?
Oh, no, just that that is a place, as with almost anything, you can find Latinate and Saxon words to use to describe the same things. Foods are a good example, but almost anything's a good example. It's a rare sentence that you can't restate from one to the other. And as I said, I think if you're going to be a connoisseur of good English and really think hard about the use of words, I encourage everybody, whether you're picking up a menu or whether you're reading a sign in public or looking at a sentence you like, to briefly think about the choices that it reflects between words from the one tradition and words from the other. You'll never run out of interesting examples to play with.
Peter Wilde asks, as an Englishman living in the United States, I have noticed that a significant difference between American English and English in England is that in England there is a definite difference between the written and the spoken word. Typically, the English written word is more formal and often stated in the third person.
That may be right. I hadn't thought about it. I don't doubt it. I'll give that some more thought. I just think in English, in British English usage, there is greater tolerance for and taste for formality, and that's probably especially true in writing. Even in signs on a subway, there's just the register of the English tends to be a little higher than what you would see in the United States. It's interesting because what's also true is I think British English is grammatically less formal than American English. So there was once, I think maybe it was Eats, Shoots, and Leaves, where I saw a review of somebody, because that book by Lynn Truss was written by, as you probably all know, an English woman complaining about bad grammar and bad uses of punctuation. And somebody said, an English person lecturing Americans about grammar is like an English person lecturing the French about food. They said it's just weird because the English are very sloppy with grammar a lot of the time. And I think there's something to that. If you're an American who's been browbeaten with American grammar books about punctuation, and you go to England, you constantly see casual approaches to punctuation. You see things like that and which used interchangeably, whereas in America, style books are all very rigorous in the difference between exactly when those things should be used. I find this all very forgivable. My feeling about the English is it's their language; they can do whatever they want with it, and that they compensate for the laxity in certain grammatical matters with a greater flair and style some of the time, as Roger mentioned. But it's one of the interesting differences to notice is there's more formality in word choice, but sometimes less formality in grammar and punctuation.
The next question is from Carl Borning from our Syracuse branch, who asks, you mentioned Dickens earlier in your presentation. In your opinion, what sets him apart?
Oh, well, I happen to love him. It's a lot of things. I mean, Dickens had an ability to create extraordinarily vivid characters. His powers of imagination to me are astonishing. But if we're just talking about the kinds of linguistic matters that we're discussing here, he had an exceptional talent for the use of rhetorical figures. The first book in the series that we're talking about here is called Classical English Rhetoric. And it overflows with examples from Dickens of clever uses of repetition of words or of the structure within sentences. He was an absolute master of these techniques. He also appears quite a bit in the book that we're talking about now, because every kind of contrast, I mean, what the new book claims is, or the most recent book claims, is that there are lots of different polarities and contrasts that are useful. I've talked about Saxon versus Latinate words. But every chapter in the book is really about another kind of contrast between the concrete and the abstract, or between sentences that branch left and sentences that branch right, or between contrasts in the cadence in a sentence. And I think a lot of great writers understand all of this unconsciously or intuitively, and nobody better than Dickens. He had a real ear or instinct for contrast, and he constantly is using it in his sentences, and the paragraphs are infused with it. And once you have an ear for these things, it's just fun. He's fun to read.
Actually, I'm going to skip ahead a bit in the order because we had another question on Dickens, and I think I just wanted to kind of include that because I think you've really touched upon the answer here as well. So, a Dickens fan here, how did Dickens manage to be so wordy and yet never seem to bog down? As you say, authors today can no longer write 100-word sentences.
Well, that is a good question, because of course, I think we all know there are plenty of people who would deny the premise of the question and would say Dickens does bog down. I mean, if you go to a modern young person and hand them Dickens, it takes a while for them to get used to reading it. It's hard. I mean, they're not used to it. The sentences are more demanding. They require more patience. I think a lot of them can eventually come to enjoy it. But if you're not used to it, it can be very difficult. Whereas young people, back when Dickens was writing, I think Thackeray talked about how he had a child who had no use for his own books and just loved Dickens. And it's a question of what your attention span is accustomed to. In any event, of course, I do find that Dickens doesn't bog down. And I think that's just a question of energy. I mean, he wrote a lot of words and long sentences, but it was never because he was merely verbose. It was never because he didn't know how to shut up. It was never because he was repeating himself. It was always because he loved the new way to say each thing. Every word mattered to him, even if there were a great many of them. And if every word has been thought about and is deliberate, the writing's going to be strong. I mean, one thing the book claims that might shock some people is that rules about style are generally overrated. You know, many people have learned that you should never use the passive voice. Passive voice is very destructive of good English. My book denies that. It gives lots of examples of beautiful English using the passive voice. What the book claims is there's only one rule that really matters in writing, and that's have a reason for everything you do. If you use the passive voice, no problem, as long as you have a reason, as long as it's accomplishing something that you mean to accomplish. And I'd say the same thing about every word. Dickens had a reason for every word he used. And that means that to me, it never bogs down.
So our next question goes back to this idea of degradation and says, what do you think we need to do in order to reverse the decline of good style?
Well, I don't want to be pessimistic. It's not clear what can be done because these things are like holding back the tides. I mean, you know, in France, they actually have part of their government that worries about these things and tries to prevent the degradation of French. And that's always seemed to me to be sort of admirable and understandable, but faintly ridiculous because it's very difficult to prevent language and its customs from changing. I'd be content just to have a committed resistance of people who love good English, by which I don't just mean accurate English, but I mean English that aspires to do great things. This is another claim in the book, is that most people who care about English now and wring their hands about it and are worried about degradation, I think a lot of times they worry about the wrong things. They get obsessed with little mistakes people make, Like they get really upset about the fact that people have lost the ability to distinguish between the word disinterested and the word uninterested. Well, let me tell you, especially as a lawyer, I like the distinction between those words, and I really regret it when people lose track of the difference between them. But if good English is just a matter of avoiding those kinds of mistakes, then we end up just back in a world where the best that English can be is free from error and very, very plain. And I think the greater loss in our times is not just mistakes like that, like bad punctuation and misusing words like that, although that's bad, but it's the complete loss of the appreciation of the ability to do the kinds of things Lincoln or Churchill did, love of contrast, tolerance or encouragement of a well-written long sentence, or putting up with and applauding a beautifully chosen, less common word, instead of always trying to search for the one that's the most easily understood by everybody every single time. I think if we just had a community of people who believed in these things and took them more seriously, I'm not sure we could stop the overall trends that we don't like, but at least we would have some solace for those who are in the tribe that do care about these things. And I'd settle for more solace, even if I can't stop the overall bad trend.
So our next question is from Millicent Ambrosio, who asks, do you think Lincoln used the duality of diction in order to address two audiences of American society, divided by class, the educated elite and the plain working folks?
Could be. I've thought about that. I mean, I don't know. We don't know exactly what Lincoln was thinking. He used these different kinds of diction constantly. Once you're alert to what I'm describing in this sort of alternation between Saxon and Latin words, if you start looking for it, you'll see it a lot. You'll especially see it a lot in Lincoln. And I mean, in the book, there are dozens and dozens of examples, including many from Lincoln. So in the Gettysburg Address, there's a lot of examples, which is a famous place for Saxon language, but actually includes a lot of beautiful alternation between Saxon and Latin. I don't know how conscious Lincoln was of any of this. I'm quite sure he didn't sit around worrying about etymology, and I'm not suggesting anybody else should either. I just think if you understand this stuff, it's a little easier to use it and to recognize it and understand what's going on. I think Lincoln just tried to do things that sounded right to him, and his intuition was very rich and well developed from all the reading he'd done. And so if you could have a conversation with Lincoln about why he kept restating things in those two ways, I don't know if he would have said that, but that might have been part of it. I mean, that was part of Lincoln's gift, is that he could say very uplifting, inspiring things, but he also had this ability to connect with the common man. And he did both. And that probably that instinct in him that we see in a lot of different aspects of his presidential character is also working its way out in the language he used. Seems like a plausible theory to me. And you could say the same thing, I imagine, about Churchill. There he is on the radio, and he's talking on the radio to a people of completely different class and different education. And he wants to move every one of them. And so he uses some language that's going to be very appealing to people who are highly educated and recognize the long words and are at home with them. And then he uses very plain, very visual language that can appeal to absolutely everybody, whether they've ever had any significant education or not.
So our next question is from Marshall Rudder, who writes, I am a senior lawyer who has been encouraged by such writers as Brian Garner to write shorter, simpler sentences with simpler words. I find my personal writing to be much less interesting and literate than it was earlier in my life. Do you find this to be prevalent in legal writing and personal writing by lawyers?
Well, it's true that there is a culture, in our legal culture, we try to teach our students in general to be clear and simple. And I think part of the reason is that education, in a sense, has to be mass produced. I mean, if you're going to write books that are going to sell and they're going to be taught to lots of students, you need advice that's good advice for everybody. And if you want to give advice that's good advice for everybody, it's got to be one size fits all. And the best advice, if you're going to give one piece of advice, is keep it simple and clear. Because most people, if they try to do more than that, are going to not do it well, at least at first, maybe never. And so that's the advice that gets handed down. But then since people only hear that advice, they start thinking it's the only good thing to ever try to do. And I think that's too bad, because I think there are greater things that can be done, maybe not by everybody, but if you love English and you've got any talent for it and you like to read, I think that after you've mastered being clear and concise, there are little things you can do to be clear and concise and memorable, clear and concise and noticeable. But to understand how to be memorable and noticeable, you've got to go a little bit beyond the advice to just keep it plain. So I encourage, after you've mastered clarity and concision, consideration of what some of the other principles are that elevate prose a little bit beyond that. I think if you read great legal writing by great judges who really know how to write, and there are a few who are in that category, or great lawyers, they've usually got a little bit more going on than just being plain and clear. I mean, plain, let's put it this way, plain and clear is the most important thing if you don't have it. I mean, anybody who's read prose that isn't clear just wishes it were that. But once you've learned how to be clear, isn't there more to learn? That's the theory of the book, is that the book I've written is not the right first book for anybody. The right first book for anybody is a book about being clear. But isn't there a place for a second book after you figured out how to be clear? Someplace that talks about how to be clear and then more. And I think there's room for all of us to think about that.
Our next question comes from Katie Parker, who asks, did Shakespeare use Saxon and Latinate language differences to indicate character status or differences in characters?
How interesting. Well, the book does talk about Shakespeare. I haven't used him in these examples today because our time is limited, but he is a master, of course, because he's a master at everything about English, at alternation between Saxon and Latinate words. The most obvious use that Shakespeare makes of this is to sort of underscore the sense or the meaning or the feeling of what he's trying to say, is that I can't do justice to it without more slides, and I don't want to do more slides. But my guess is that if you saw examples, if you go into Shakespeare with this distinction in mind between different families of words and when he uses each, you'll find him using it for a lot of different purposes. To punctuate, it's a kind of punctuation for the ear. It's the contrast can set things out. If he's trying to picture somebody in Macbeth talking about murder, he'll use very simple language because it creates a very particular effect. Or he wants to puncture pomposity. Saxon words are best for that. There probably are examples of him using it to emphasize class distinctions, but I think actually, in some ways, that's really the most obvious way to use these words, is to put highfalutin language into the mouths of highfalutin people. And Shakespeare uses this principle in a lot of other ways that are actually, I think, subtler, harder to understand, and also more interesting and rewarding, which I would encourage anybody who enjoys Shakespeare to think about next time you're reading it.
Our next question is from Joanne Bowdown Ansley, who asks, why do you think there is so much use of fillers, i.e., awesome, like? It limits conversation as the final thought takes so long to be reached.
Well, indeed it does. I don't have, I'm afraid, anything very new to say about that issue. Of course, I can't stand it. And I try very hard to teach my law students to completely expunge all those words from their spoken vocabulary. It's tough because they're like weeds that overtake everything else where they grow. And we all know perfectly well that, especially in the language of young people, you can listen to them on public transportation or sometimes in your own family and hear a very high percentage of the words in their sentences are meaningless. What I hate to see is that sometimes those tendencies then even find their way into written language. Of course, they're much less common there. But, the word like, when used as a filler word, is now something you will more often see introduced into writing to convey a certain slang or informal sensibility. And some little part of me dies when I see that, but I suppose it's a trend that just makes me sound old when I complain about, so I'll leave it there.
Roberta Klein asks, how did Poe appeal to such a broad audience when his vocabulary is so Latinate or Frenchified?
Well, I'd have to think a little more about that. I haven't studied Poe as carefully as the other writers we've talked about. I like him, and I'm familiar with some of his stuff, and he appears occasionally in these books, but not that often. I do think that in his work, because I can think of a couple of examples, you do see a lot of good use of Saxon language. If he has a higher percentage of Frenchified words, I'll take your word for it. It's probably true, but I'm not able, as I sit here now, to explain it. It might have something to do, though, if I'm just thinking off the top of my head, with the content of what he's writing. So Poe wrote very dark stories about people doing very dark things. And I mentioned the value of contrast of all kinds. One interesting form of contrast or polarity that you can get in writing is between Frenchified or highfalutin diction and language and much lower substance. It's sort of a cousin to what I was saying earlier about during question time in the House of Commons. You'll sometimes get an insult dressed up in more formal language. When you're saying something crude or low, sometimes higher language, higher register of language makes it easier to take. And also the sort of cruder or lower, darker substance makes the higher language more excusable. So that may be part of what you're seeing in Poe's case. I have to think more about that. It's a very interesting question.
Our next question is from Orrin Davidson, who asks, can you comment on Justice Scalia's prose in his decisions?
I regard Justice Scalia as the finest prose stylist the Supreme Court has had since Robert Jackson. He's a wonderful writer. Sometimes he overdid it, in my judgment. Scalia was prone to sarcasm that I think didn't improve his opinions. But when you read a Scalia dissent, you usually know it. You usually know it without seeing the name, because he cared intensely about language and he chose his words very carefully and expressed himself with a real sense of fire and eloquence. Sometimes if people don't like his judicial philosophy, it's hard to take. But if you can look past any disagreement you might have with the opinion he's expressing and just think about it from the standpoint of English, he had a beautiful command of it. And Scalia is somebody who grew up with a lot of Latin in his education. And it didn't make him a Latinate writer, but it made him very attentive to language. And I do think studying inflected languages like Latin and Greek can be a very powerful thing for improving English, not because it makes you more Latinate in your selection of words, because hopefully it doesn't, but because understanding a language like Latin requires exceptional precision and attention to detail of a kind that ordinary English doesn't. So it's like swinging a baseball bat with a donut on it. If you're used to doing that, it makes you much more attentive to language in general. And I think Scalia was the most attentive writer to his choice of words and the way he wrote his sentences that we've had in recent memory.
So our next question is actually a good piece of connected tissue to our next happy hour next week from Richard Madden, who asks, can you make a comment about the Canterbury Tales?
Not competently. I try to do what my daughter calls staying in my lane. And I don't have the expertise on the Canterbury Tales. I've enjoyed them, but I haven't studied them in depth the way that I've tried to study the things I write about. So I'm going to leave that to next week's speaker. I especially don't dare do it when you're about to have a speaker next week who can really do it right. The contrast would be with my incompetence would be overwhelming.
So actually a comment here that you might perhaps want to comment on from Bill Kennedy of our Cleveland branch, who states, I would assert that the one essential requirement for good writing is extensive reading. I would also say that Shakespeare was meant to be heard rather than read. I think modern English speakers hear spoken English more often than they read it, but unfortunately they don't often hear Shakespeare.
Well, it's a good point. One can compensate for that a little bit by reading Shakespeare aloud, if only to oneself, because I do think that the sound of Shakespeare's language is part of the magic of it. Of course, it takes some time, and we have to remember, in a lot of ways, we don't know quite what it sounded like. There have been attempts to reconstruct what English sounded like in Shakespeare's time. Some people think that it was the English as it sounded then was much further back in the throat. Some people think it sounded more like Southern modern American English than like modern British English. So it's hard to be sure just how some of it sounded. But of course, a great deal of it is in iambic pentameter, and there are rhythms that work their way into the language. I do think that if you're reading well, you sort of are hearing it, even if you're not hearing it spoken, because I think good writing is done just like good reading is done with the ear, just the same way that good writing is done with the ear. And that if you want to write well, you sort of need to read your own writing out loud, at least to yourself, before you're finished with it, or else you don't really know how it sounds to the reader. So I do think that even if it's hard to get the chances to see and hear Shakespeare performed, everybody can enjoy and benefit from reading it silently or out loud on one's own, because there's so much to enjoy and learn from.
Our next question is from C. Anderson, asking, could you comment on the lack of understanding of conditionals? It seems that few people know the past perfect tense.
Well, I think it's probably a longer conversation than we can do right here, because it's quite true that most people don't know that, and most people don't know what a passive participle is. I mean, very few people know what that word means, but they know how to use passive participles. They know how to refer to, the forgotten country and the overfed dog. So there are many things that people know how to do much better than they know how to explain. And when it comes to conditionals, I'm not sure where we are in that spectrum. I take it the person asking the question isn't just worried about people's inability to understand why they're doing what they're doing. You're probably concerned about their inability to use the construction accurately, whether they understand the wording behind it or the terminology behind it or not. And that may be right. I don't know if that's actually a decline or not. I think there are a lot of complex, by our standards, complex grammatical points that people have struggled with, at least especially in America, for a very long time. And that if you go back and look at common writing from 100 years ago, you would also see misused. But that's not an authoritative answer. That's just speculation.
Dorothy Leonard asks our next question. Edmund Burke was an Irish with a brogue. What was his magic?
Well, I sure love Burke. Of course, nowadays he's an example of somebody whose prose often seems too flowery for modern taste. But there are many examples in the book showing him using that flowery language to then set up a crushing Saxon climax to a paragraph that he's writing. I think Samuel Johnson once said that you could get stuck under in a pouring rain. You could go look for shelter under a shed and get stuck there with Edmund Burke, and you'd know within 30 seconds you were standing next to one of the greatest men alive, because everything that came out of his mouth was eloquent and dignified. I don't know how to explain his magic, and I wish I knew just what he sounded like to the ear, because after all this time, I'm not sure we do know what the character of whatever brogue he had. But I do consider him one of the most eloquent statesmen that the English language has ever produced.
So I believe our final question is going to come from C. Anderson, who asks, the British vocabulary seems much more colorful than the American version. Would you agree?
I might. I think I'd go back to what I was mentioning earlier, that I think in America, on account of a sort of cultural norm that has to do with democracy and celebration of the common person and the idea of erasing distinctions between people, there is a tendency to stay away from words that not everybody understands. And so words are, I think, we do get new words into our language, like texting, new words that come into our lexicon because of developments in technology and so forth. But we lose a lot of words. They go onto the endangered species list, like animals that get extinguished and then they're never to be seen again. And I think in England that happens a little more slowly, because I think in England there's a less for better or for worse. I think from a linguistic standpoint, it's for worse in any event. It's for better in England from a linguistic standpoint. There is less pressure to abandon words that not everybody understands. I think that in public speech, people are willing to use words that are a little more challenging without as much apology and without having their political consultants whisper to them that somebody might not understand that. They might think you're a snob, you better get rid of it. Probably that happens in both cultures, but I think it happens more here. So I think in England, it's a little easier for a wider range of words to survive for a little longer. Again, that's not that's not the subject, the result of a study. That's my informal speculation, but that's my guess at part of what's going on. Let me say, since that was apparently the last question, how much I've enjoyed the chance to spend some time with people who care about these issues, because of course, most people don't. And I think those who do love the English language and the beautiful use of it need to stick together. And I'm grateful for the opportunity to spend some time with some new friends. So thank you all for coming.
Thank you for your generosity in answering these questions. And now, as a special kind of thank you for everyone who has stayed to this point, we're actually going to raffle away 2 of the books that we talked about here today, Classical English Style. I'd like to announce, just making sure that the winners are here. Yes, so Irene Fitzpatrick-Smoot of our Princeton branch, you'll be receiving a copy, as well as Marshall Rudder, who I believe asked a question. So not because you did ask a question, but you will be receiving a book as well from our Los Angeles branch. So congratulations to both our winners. I'm now actually going to introduce the Executive Director of the English Speaking Union, Karen Karpovich. Karen?
Thank you so much, Ward, and thank you so much, Rob. That was a very eloquent discussion. Gentle and very understanding of all the nuances and the differences. Because sometimes discussions like this can be very uncomfortable, but this was a wonderful discussion on that. Thank you so much for being here and spending the hour with us. You have a very, very good people here. We'll definitely love reading your book and learning more about what you believe in and how you approach language. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. I think I'm having a little trouble with your audio, but you were thanking me, and I'm very grateful.
Hear me now?
Better.
Yes. Is it better? Okay. I just want to thank you again and thank everyone. And as everyone knows, the programs are actually on branches. And next week, we're going to have a discussion on Chaucer and Chaucer, A European Life by Marion Turner, which should be another in a kind of theme in regard to language, because we've been talking a lot about poetry and now we're talking a lot about the English language. So please come next week, April 21st at 4 o'clock to hear this discussion on Chaucer. I think it should be very interesting. It's at 4 o'clock, a little earlier than today. And as you all know, the English Speaking Union is a membership organization. And if you're not a member, we do encourage you to become one. So the form that you're actually going to fill out, the actual evaluation form of the talk today, you actually have an opportunity to become a member, and we do encourage you to do so. Again, thank you, Ward, thanks, Paul, and thank you, Roger. And have a good evening, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.